Today I'm going to talk about a bit of content that probably feels a little bit too salient, a little bit too real given the current circumstances we're all living in. But it's a really important topic because it relates to our health and well being. So, stress, the physical and psychological experience and response to stress, as well as promoting health. Specifically through coping with stress. So, again, I feel like this is a very salient topic. We're all very stressed right now. We're all dealing with a lot. The idea is that there's more adaptive and less adaptive ways to deal with stress. Stress is actually not in and of itself an inherently negative thing. It's sort of all about how you deal with it. So it's important to know what stress is and how it impacts the body so we can know how to proactively look after our own health and well being, particularly to use our garbage corporate speak in these trying times. Okay, so first off, talking a little bit about the core terminology around the issue of stress. Stress overall, we all know what it is. We live, particularly in our culture, in a sort of a fast paced, high strung, stressful environment. But this process can be broken down in terms of it being a series of responses to things that stress us out. So, stress is going to involve stressful stimuli or stressors, and it's also going to involve our perception of the stimuli as stressful, as well as the stress response that goes along with it. So, the stressor is going to be the event that we view as being stressful. So, it threatens us, it overwhelms us, it just is an uncomfortable psychological experience. A number of things could be viewed as a stressor, but it's going to be individually based. There are certain things that would stress one person out that would sort of roll off the back of another. So it's really all going to be about what the stressor means to you. And this is the process of appraisal. This is when we decide whether or not something that we're encountering should be viewed as a stressor. Again, the idea is that thresholds of what we perceive as stressful is going to depend person to person. For example, something like social interaction, being part of a group, or going to a party. Think about how, for some people, that is the farthest thing from a stressor. It's something you do to unwind, it's something you do to have fun. But if somebody has social anxiety, their appraisal of that same event is going to be very, very different. It might be overwhelming, it might be very taxing, and it might make you stressed out. So it's all about how we view and respond to the stressor via the process of appraisal. The stress reaction is going to be what happens to you once you've decided that something you're encountering is a stressor. So, your stress response or your stress reaction is going to be a cascade of emotional, physical, and psychological responses to your stressor. A lot of things happen to your body when you're stressed out, and this has been pretty extensively studied, right? If you ever have been overwhelmed or stressed, you might feel your heart start to rush a little bit. You might have your blood get flowing. And additionally, there's a lot of research on the endocrinological response to stress. There's a host of hormones that we've identified as being engaged in the typical stress response. One of the most famous ones, and you're going to see this mentioned a lot when the topic of stress comes up, is the hormone cortisol. You might be familiar with the hormone cortisol. It often gets mentioned in commercials having to do with weight loss. This is because the hormone cortisol, it gets immediately engaged when we are stressed out, and it has the immediate effect of sort of getting your arousal up, getting you sort of fired up, because if you're engaging a stressor, your body naturally is inclined to think that you have to engage, you have to actually do something to confront the stressor. But a ton of research on cortisol has found that the consistent and chronic um, overabundance of cortisol in perpetually stressed out people has a lot of negative health consequences. It does damage to your heart long term. It does damage to other areas of your body long term. It definitely has the long term effect of having you gain weight, particularly in your core, that sort of spare tire weight gain. So, there's been a ton of research on just what cortisol does to your body. It's an important hormone. Stress is an important psychological experience, but the idea is that chronic over stress taxes your body in a way that we can study. And so, one of those mechanisms that we know stress leads to long term health outcomes is through the overabundance of cortisol in our systems. Okay, so the stress reaction, again, there's going to be physical responses as well as emotional and psychological. We can all sort of understand that there's a lot of cognitive processes that happen when we're stressed out. We think a lot, we're worrying a lot. So it's a cascade of all of these psychological and physical responses. Okay, so again, the idea of appraisal, this is critically that what is considered a stressor for one person is not quite as stressful for another person. And additionally, the way that you appraise an event is going to determine the kind of reaction you have. So, something being appraised as a threat that you sort of don't know how to confront, you sort of don't think you have a solution for properly addressing the stressor, your stress response is likely going to be distracted and it's not going to help you. It's going to overwhelm you. A stressful event that for someone else is sort of a challenge that they know they can rise to meet, right? That stress response likely is still going to happen, but it's going to direct your energy in a more adaptive way. So, different stimuli being appraised as different levels of stressful can help determine the way that people respond to events. So, obviously, if there's a big stressful event like a tough test that you're going to take, to appraise that event as a stressor that you don't think you're capable of handling, that's a detrimental response. But if you can reframe the way you look at a stressful event by thinking about the ways that you can tackle the problem, then that stress response can be targeted to make you more focused. So the idea is stress we all perceive as so unpleasant, right? It can feel overwhelming, it can feel like it's physically uncomfortable. The idea is why do we have this capacity for stress if it's a bad thing? Well, it's actually not in and of itself necessarily a bad thing. Stress does have an adaptive function. The idea is that brief experiences of stress mobilize your body to meet whatever the stressor is. It engages and mobilizes your body to try and fix whatever the challenge is that you're meeting. So, short term, you actually do see a boost to your immune system response. Again, chronic stress is over the course of time detrimental to your immune response, but that's largely because those momentary stress responses actually mobilize and engage your immune system response. But chronically overworking your immune system can tax it to the point where it becomes less effective over time. But if you think about all of those physical consequences of stress that I mentioned, they're very motivating, they're very mobilizing. Your blood pumping, your heart racing. The idea is this is your body getting ready to meet a challenge. You're met with a predator, your stress response is going to mobilize you physically so that you have an easier time running away. So that's why we have a stress response. The idea is that it can be, in a momentary sense, very useful. And clearly, our ancestors would have been able to benefit by that stress response given that it mobilizes the body to action. The difference between our ancestors and ourselves is that our version of stressors is not needing to run away from a predator. It's long term chronic stressors. It's worry about paying the bills. It's worry about long term consequences of our choices. It's these bigger, deeper worries that we kind of can't get away from. So that's why you might be able to say that we're sort of chronically stressed because of the modern way that the world works. So, this is why stress is typically seen as not a good thing because most of us are not thinking about all of the ways that stress can momentarily engage us. We're thinking about the way that extreme and prolonged stress physically exhausts us, right? So, you're all college students, so you're probably well acquainted with the idea of feeling a lot of stress, maybe when you have a lot of exams or assignments coming up. The idea is that stress response is not necessarily going to help you. It's going to be prolonged and it's going to exhaust you because that stress response is taxing your systems. It's taxing you physically and psychologically to the point of exhaustion. So, a key factor in when stress is harmful and when stress is helpful is whether or not there's a chance for you to take a breath. So, recovery and healing is key, right? So, if you have a really overwhelming set of assignments, maybe it's final exam week, you might feel like you're sort of pushed to the brink because you don't get a chance to take a breath. But if after you confront the stressor, your body has a chance to pause and recover and get back to the status quo, get back to stasis, then stress is not necessarily a bad thing. But again, I'm sure you can all relate to the idea that when we encounter modern day stressors, they seem to be chronic and therefore exhausting. In categorizing the stimuli that are often categorized as stressors, we typically think about four broad categories of stressors. These are going to be things that range from the sort of everyday stuff we deal with to those sort of once in a lifetime sort of traumatic events. They've largely been lumped into these four categories. So, for example, significant life changes. Any event that usurps your status quo could be seen as a stressor. So this could even be something that's happy or wanted. Like, take, for example, when you moved to college. That's something that likely you were excited for and you wanted to do. And even though it was something you wanted to do, likely you could probably relate to the fact that it was stressful, it was overwhelming. Similarly to something like getting married. This is typically a happy event in someone's life, but it comes with a lot of changes and thus a lot of stress. But this could be other things that are maybe not so happy or wanted, things like a divorce or losing a job or changing a job. All of these things would constitute significant life changes. Again, the way that you approach and appraise these events is going to determine how you respond to them and how adaptively and how healthily you respond to them. So then the other kinds, one is catastrophes. So these are going to be events that are inherently dangerous, such that pretty much anyone would view them as a stressor. For example, living through a pandemic, I think we can all agree is inherently stressful and catastrophic. But also events like living through a natural disaster, experiencing a traumatic sexual assault, or being the victim of a violent crime, or being in a serious accident. All of those would be things that everyone could recognize is a stressful event. And so catastrophic events are going to inherently be viewed as stressors. Then your more low level, day to day kind of stressful events, chronic daily hassles. So this is that sort of you're overwhelmed with too many tasks at work or in the home. Maybe you have children that you need to raise, or you have a lot of family responsibilities. The idea is that there's just lots of little things that we're all handling day to day. And individually, they might not seem overwhelming, but we can become overwhelmed when there's too much chronic daily hassles in our life. So just when we have so much on our plate that we feel like we don't have a chance to get a handle on it, having too much of that in your life is going to end up being stressful as well. Then another category of stressor is to be an individual of low social status or power. So to be someone who is impoverished, to be someone who's in a disadvantaged social group within a culture. That's going to be one of those chronic stressors that sort of chip away at your health and well-being. So if, for example, you're a person of color in the United States, this represents and presents a lot of instances in which you sort of have day to day experiences of making your status known to yourself, whether it be your interactions at work, being the victim of microaggressions, being the victim of um, unpleasant encounters with law enforcement. These are all the sorts of experiences that individuals who are systematically disenfranchised in our country are going to encounter chronically throughout the lifetime. So there's a ton of research on how socioeconomic status and ethnicity relate to chronic stress. It overall has a detrimental health on people's well-being to be someone experiencing low social status or to not have much systematic power. So all of these would constitute potential stressors whether you experience one or the other, right? We're all living different lives. The idea is that we might not all experience all of these all at once. It's just going to be determined by your life experiences and you as an individual. And again, the same thing that represents a stressor for one person might be less of a stressor for another person, depending on other factors present, including appraisal style. Now, an important theoretical perspective on the stress response developed by Hans Selye is what we call the general adaptation syndrome. So, this is the basic model that identifies the course of how stress impacts our bodies. So, Selye famously theorize that the stress response is important for engaging that defensive mobilization that would, in theory, be helpful when we're encountering a challenge or a stressor, but that this response is inherently exhausting. So, after our first mobilizing stress response, we become exhausted and fatigued, and we need enough time to reset. So, he basically created a graph that depicts these different phases of the stress response. So, if you were to think about a stressor like just something coming into your view that scares or surprises you, right? You could think about your body's response as occurring along these phases. So you might kind of jump and then you feel your heart pound. Then you reach a resistance phase. So, how are you actually going to cope with this stressor? Are you going to run away? Are you going to confront it and fight it? So, then this is where your body is actively engaged with trying to figure out how to cope with the stressor. So your body can only live in this stage for so long because it's that very high arousal state that's very inherently exhausting. So ideally, when you're encountering a stressor, you're not spending too long at this state before the stressor is dealt with. Because what happens after the stress response moves into phase 3 is that your energy level is a bit depleted and you become exhausted. So, again, anytime you've maybe gone through a very stressful phase with a lot of exams, think about that exhaustion that you felt after you were done. This was your body necessarily needing time to recover from that stress response. So, if you don't have time to reach that restful phase, you're going to experience a lot of detrimental consequences. Jade, let me finish. Okay. So I've been mentioning this concept of chronic stress. So, this is the idea that when one has a lot of chronic and repeated stress, your body doesn't have enough time to recover. And so, you're going to experience physical health consequences, and it might actually accelerate aging. As anyone who's ever seen the quick aging process that United States presidents experience over the course of their 4 to 8 terms, right? The idea is that a lot of stress over a long period of time is going to have that stress response constantly mobilized, and you never get that chance to recover. And so there's research indicating that having a lot of prolonged or chronic stress in your life does lead to more rapid aging. And overall, it sort of leads to a lot of wear and tear on your body. There are some interesting gender differences on the stress response. There's been some research to indicate that men versus women's stress response might look a little bit different. So, for example, I'm sure you're all familiar with the phrase fight or flight, the idea that our classic stress response is either going to mobilize us to fight the threat or to run away from it. There's another term that has been coined to describe a slightly different stress response that women are more likely than men to engage in, your tend and befriend. This is the idea that as opposed to just being limited to fight or flight, sometimes when we're experiencing a stressor, it might mobilize us to affiliate with others and to lean on others in our lives. And so, for example, women in the face of stress will often tend to lean on their friendships and to lean on the meaningful relationships and social connections that they have in their life. So, in the face of stress, women will often want to tend to their loved ones and want to continue to meet that need for affiliation. Now, I mentioned the stress hormone of cortisol. That is often associated with that sort of like mobilization and arousal effect of stress. But oxytocin, you might have heard this called the love hormone. This is actually a hormone that will often be released in the face of a stressful event. So, oxytocin famously is released when women have just given birth or when they're breastfeeding. It helps promote affiliation. Oxytocin actually can occur in the face of stress, and it doesn't necessarily increase that arousal or agitated state. It might increase this tendency towards bonding and affiliation. Men's responses, on the other hand, again, this is a generalization. This is not universally true. But as opposed to women's heightened tendency towards tend and befriend, men are more often to withdraw socially when experiencing stress. And they're more likely to turn to alcohol or become aggressive in the face of stress. Again, this is a generalization. Not all women are going to tend and befriend, and not all men are going to withdraw and become aggressive, but you do see gender differences whereby these patterns show heightened levels in men versus women. As I mentioned, there's a lot of research on the way that stress affects your health, and basically trying to investigate the mechanisms that occur in the body whereby stress leads to diminished health outcomes. So, in answering the question how stress actually increases your risk of health consequences and disease, a niche field called psychoneuroimmunology studies how psychological, neural, and endocrine or hormonal processes affect health. Like I mentioned, for example, a lot of studies on the effect of stress and cortisol on health has found that, for example, heightened stress does tend to lead to heightened levels of cortisol in the body, and that those heightened cortisol levels tend to lead to, for example, higher levels of heart disease and atherosclerotic plaques in the heart that can lead to a cardiac event. So basically, it seems like when you're dealing with chronic stress, there appears to be a trade off between the stress response and the immune response. The more your stress response is mobilized, the more your immune system is a bit exhausted and doesn't have time to catch up. And so you do see effects whereby stress is associated with likelihood of catching a cold, for example. Plenty of research has found that experiencing a lot of stress does tend to, over the long term, diminish your immune response, and that this does, in fact, lead to getting sick more often. So, this is definitely something to keep in mind now that we're dealing with this pandemic. The idea that managing our stress is important for our health and well being and our ability to stay healthy. Further research on the way that stress is associated with disease outcomes, for example, has found that there does appear to be a link between outcomes in individuals suffering from AIDS and stress. Stress appears to worsen the progression and development of AIDS in individuals that suffer from it. There's been a lot of research trying to establish there being a link between stress and the likelihood of getting cancer. This appears to be a little bit more controversial, given that some research finds an affirmative link and some research doesn't. I would say overall, there's a vast body of research indicating that stress can exacerbate diseases, but not necessarily the case that we can uh, adequately say that stress is the causal factor. So, given that plenty of research has found that stress is associated with an immune response and cancer is a disease of the immune system, it certainly is not a good thing for someone suffering from cancer to experience a lot of stress. Whether or not stress actually is associated with getting cancer, again, that link is not quite so clear. So, again, I'd like to stress that any research findings along these lines not necessarily, it does not necessarily rise to the level of helping us establish that stress causes cancer or causes you to get AIDS. Obviously, that's a bridge too far. But I would say the research is clear that experiencing a lot of chronic stress is not great for your health long term. And if you do suffer from a disease, it's certainly not going to be helpful in terms of the progression of the disease. If anything, research indicates that it can be detrimental to disease progression. Again, a ton of research has been interested on the effect of stress and heart disease. I think it's kind of popular wisdom that the chronically stressed out individual is eventually going to work themselves up to a heart attack. There's actually some truth to that, that there is definitely a link between stress and heart disease. So there is research looking at how stress might lead to heart disease. Again, cortisol appears in the mix here quite often. Again, it appears that long term stress and the changes that it makes to your hormonal levels, to your immune system, does have the downstream consequence of leading to heart disease through the path of buildup of atherosclerosis. So, this is basically fatty plaques that build up in the arteries around your heart and can eventually lead to a heart attack. So, stress over time does lead to blockages and can increase the likelihood of suffering from heart disease. Again, like I mentioned, that image of the chronically stressed out person, you might be familiar with the term type A personality. So, there is some research indicating that there are differences between your so called type A individuals, your go-getters, your high-strung individuals, highly competitive individuals, and your type B individuals who tend to be a little bit more laid back, not quite so competitive, not quite so ambitious. So this type A trait, even though it might be associated with achieving success in certain senses, there is research indicating that individuals who lean more type A, again, experience more chronic stress, and as such, there is a correlation between type A personalities and heart disease, likely through the mechanism of stress. Having a high stress job, so whether or not you're a type A person, just being in a high stress job, medical professionals at this moment in time, and likely all of the time, high powered attorneys, you name it, any sort of high stress work, again, there's a relationship between doing that high stress work and being of an increased risk for heart disease. So, plenty of research in these various arenas indicate that long term stress, again, not momentary stress, long term chronic and prolonged stress in various ways, either through a personality lens or through a work environment lens, does tend to increase your risk for heart disease. Again, there's a lot of theorizing and a lot of research trying to establish the mechanisms whereby stress is going to lead to health outcomes. And so there's a lot of different avenues or pathways by which this can happen. For example, there are researchers who are particularly interested in the behaviors that stressed out people engage in. This is one pathway whereby stress might be detrimental to your health. So, one thing people sometimes opt to do when they're feeling stressed is to engage in unhealthy behavior like drinking alcohol or smoking, or it might cause you to want to eat garbage food, it might upset your sleep. The tendency to engage in those unhealthy behaviors is certainly one pathway whereby stress is going to lead to diminished health outcomes. Again, this pathway of hormonal increases, so an increase of cortisol, again, this tends to lead to a lot of the pathways that eventually can lead to poor health outcomes down the line. So, experiencing immune suppression, heart disease, autonomic nervous system effects, so high blood pressure, which again can lead to heart disease, all of these do tend to be the result of stress via the pathway of a overabundance of stress hormones, again, in particular cortisol. I've linked a TED Talk here if you'd like to look at it that basically discusses um, a changing perspective on stress. So basically, all of what I've described so far likely seems a little bit apocalyptic. The idea that we're chronically overstressed and stress is so bad for us that do we have cause to be sort of hopeless or scared? It's a really interesting TED Talk. I recommend you check it out. Basically, it's a stress researcher who found that a fair amount of why stress leads to poor health outcomes is a negative attitude towards stress. So basically, being stressed about being stressed just exacerbates the effect. So if you're feeling stressed, reappraising your emotional reaction and being more at peace with the fact that you're stressed and not trying to suppress that, that's important as well. So that should go hand in hand with trying to reduce the amount of stressors in our lives. We should also be seeking to reappraise the stressful events in our lives, and we can even reappraise stress itself to try and not have such a strong negative reaction to it. So I'm going to pause there and start off with the next video on coping with stress and promoting health. So, the positive flip side of this conversation on stress.